Well, Merry Christmas to everyone who would drop everything on Christmas Day in order to listen to the award-winning Newsmaker program. This is Kevin Dorn back with you briefly so that I can do a program with my very good friend Chris Kopff. Stay tuned.
It's time for the Newsmaker Show on News Talk AM 1480 WLEA. Here's Kevin Doran.
He is in Colorado. I'm in Western New York. Hi, Chris.
Hi. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you, too, pal. I have several things I want you to discuss, expand on. Or as I told you about that friend of mine in college, expatiate.
Expatiate. Very good.
I've told you that, haven't I?
I didn't know you went to college with President Bush. I didn't know that.
This guy's name was Bill David Schofer.
Okay.
And whatever that conjures up in your mind, you got it. He was from Cherokee, Iowa, and he fancied himself as an intellectual. Later went on to become a professor at the University of Maine, so maybe he was an intellectual. We never thought so. Anyway, David Schofer would go to class, and the professor would say something, and he'd say, well, Prof, could you expatiate on that? Well, the guy would expatiate on it. He'd expand on it. And I took Schofer apart one day, and I said, hey, Dave, there's no such word as expatiate. Well, you know that pretty soon profs throughout that whole college were expatiating? It does sound like a real word, doesn't it?
It's not a word, but you know what it means as soon as you hear it.
Yeah, expatiate.
No, it's a very useful word. It should be added to the dictionary.
Why don't you try it in class and see how many of your honor students pick up? Okay, here we go. I'm just going to throw out some names and concepts, and I want your reaction. Mayor Bill de Blasio.
Yes, de Blasio, in my opinion, is the result of the former mayor's unwillingness to build up any kind of, people beneath him to succeed him. It always had to be about the great, wealthy, successful businessman, mayor of New York. And the result is when he stepped down, there was no one to fill his place. And de Blasio is an accident. He really, should be the head of a ward in Brooklyn or, running a small county somewhere.
The communist section of Brooklyn, probably.
Yeah, I mean, he really, is way over his head. And he, as indeed any of us would be who had no real experience, and then gets involved running a very large city with a lot of complicated problems. And he has just had the knack of putting his foot wrong time after time. And I really blame Bloomberg for this. Bloomberg should have been using his time as mayor to build up a set of people who could succeed him. And instead, it was always about himself and his own ideas and his own often national ambitions. He was always butting into Colorado politics. And so now we're stuck with a very inexperienced person, de Blasio, who has made every situation he's in worse by always doing sort of the first thing that comes to mind instead of thinking things out and understanding that there are consequences for irresponsible statements. And the consequences, unfortunately, have been fatal in a couple of instances.
When I said the communist streets in Brooklyn, I wasn't kidding. This guy really has a long record of supporting left-wing, Sandinista, that is, communist situations.
Yes.
And, well, I guess New York deserves them, huh?
Well, I'm afraid in a way they do. They should have been able to come up with somebody better. As you know, those New Yorkers simply didn't even bother to vote during the election because it was so ludicrous. And the result is you have a person who's completely inexperienced, and I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt. You're pointing up the fact that a lot of the stuff he's doing fits his rather, 1930s leftish attitudes on things, which may have seemed like a great idea in 1935, but they're creating chaos in the city. And really, New York is going to take a while to recover from just a few years of this very incompetent person.
The cops turned their back on him.
Yep.
Some people say that was rude. He's their mayor, their commander-in-chief in a way. Others say, what are you going to do with a guy like that? You have to show that you don't approve of him. What's your reaction?
I would say he turned his back on them first.
That's right.
And that was the problem. Certainly you should not let people get away with anything, and there have to be standards. But they also needed support, and appropriate support. And he did not give the appropriate support. And that's because he's irresponsible, and he just, is not used to really understanding there are consequences for your actions and your words when you're a politician. And it's a very sad thing for them and for New York.
Well, if I were a cop in New York, and I never could be, but if I were, I would certainly feel the way most of them do. And if I were a citizen in New York, I'd walk up to the next cop I see, and I'd say, thanks, pal, for all the good work you do.
Yep.
And I hope the people of New York are doing that.
Yes, I suspect many of them are, because they understand that a city as big and diverse as New York needs police. They do not have other unities to keep them together. They're different in national origin, in religion, in a lot of ethical ways. They're very different. And turning on the police, as the mayor has done, was a very bad decision. And the consequences in the short term have so far been terrible, and the consequences in the long term are likely to be worse.
Okay, here's another name for you. Very similar to Bill de Blasio, many say, Barack Obama.
Well, yeah, it's not exactly a Christmas discussion at this stage.
It's what we've got, pal. Yeah.
The president has responded by one of the most catastrophic defeats ever given in a midterm to a president, by simply being determined to do everything he can to make the next couple of years disruptive. And it's certainly on the national level, the promise of short-term amnesty for so many people who are here illegally has been very demoralizing for the rule of law. We were just about in a situation where we could have turned the situation over in Cuba, because with the problem in oil prices, Russia can no longer support them. And instead, he, and I must say, with some help from the Bishop of Rome, has come in to really rescue the communist regime in Cuba. And as Raul Castro has been very frank in saying, he had to make no concessions, did not have to change any of the policies of his government in order to get recognition from the United States. So the president has certainly done a number of things that have been both internally and externally, domestically and internationally, very destructive for the next couple of years.
This is a good time, I think, to clear up a couple things. Not with you. You don't need to be informed on this, but I hear Charles Krautheimer say on the Fox report at 6 o'clock some evenings, Catholics think their Pope is infallible. That's not true. He's infallible in matters of faith and morals. It's only happened on a handful of times in the 2,000 years of the Catholic Church. Now, Cardinal John Henry Newman, whom you knew, not personally, but you know who he is, he was made a cardinal in the late 19th century, and he opposed the promotion of the doctrine of papal infallibility. It came in 1870. Because he said, now a lot of simple Catholics are going to say, well, everything the guy says is infallible.
Right.
Well, Pope Frank was hardly infallible in the Roman thing. Let me tell you what might have made it a good move, in my humble, all right? If he'd said, if Castro said, okay, all the priests we exiled, to say nothing of all the priests we murdered, we'll let them come back in. The exiled priests can come back in if they're still alive. If not, others can. We will stop persecuting the church. then Pope Frank would have had a reason to do what he did. As it was a prudential judgment, and in the opinion of many, a blunder. Time will tell. Time will tell. But that concept of the Pope always being infallible, I cringe every time I hear it. He's not infallible, except in matters of faith and morals.
Right.
And that certainly wasn't faith and morals.
Since 1950, I don't think.
Nothing since 1950.
Yeah, I mean, that's a long time. Although it could have been used recklessly, I think Newman was also worried about that. It has not been used recklessly. No. And so
1850.
Be aware of this issue. There's a difference between the Pope maintaining the traditions of the Church and speaking for them authoritatively, and the Pope as the head of a state and the head of a church making prudential judgments that any executive has to make. And as you just pointed out, in this particular case, a lot of us think he did not make a wise decision. He needed to negotiate. It must be said that the famous example of this happening was in 1929 when Pope Pius the 11th and the government of Italy, Mr. Mussolini, signed agreements together, and the Church got the chance to have their schools be protected, their hospitals recognized. I mean, there was a whole set of concessions made by the government of Italy, in return for which the Catholic Church also recognized the government of Italy as a legitimate, a legitimate political ruler of the country. Which
all right, 1950 was the Pius XII.
Yep.
On the Assumption, which had always been held in the Church, but he made it official. All right. Before that, you got to go way back to 1840 and the Immaculate Conception, Pius IX.
Pius IX.
I wish people would stop saying this. Listen, as long as I've got the soapbox.
Yes, let's hear your speech. I want to hear it.
Well, this is a strictly local issue, but it's one that burns me up. So brace yourself, brother. I mentioned this on a show this week. We have a hospital that's in real danger of closing. It was founded by a Catholic priest in Hornell, New York, Father James Early, back in the 1870s or 80s. What happened was he was called down to Loder Street, which in addition to being filled with bars, it was also the place they took guys who were run over by trains, and they amputated their legs. So he was called over there, and he witnessed this amputation. He said, well, this is barbarian. So he went back to Ireland. He was Irish, and he recruited a bunch of nuns, and somehow he raised, actually sisters. Nuns, as you know, are women who are in convents that are closed off, cloistered convents. He went back and got a bunch of nursing sisters and brought them over here, and they founded St. James Hospital. Now, it was a Catholic hospital, founded by Catholics. And, by the same token, as you well know, members of the Methodist Church, the Lutheran Church, Baptist, Catholics, they founded hospitals, if I've been saying churches, I apologize, hospitals all over the country. Now, here in Hornell, there's something called Catholic Healthcare East, which is now united with something called Trinity, another, quote, Catholic, unquote, organization. They have done everything. I can't imagine what they didn't do that they could have done. They've done everything to wreck this hospital, which is now on the verge of closing. Well, that's enough to make anyone very upset. Hospital 150 years old, run well, state-of-the-art. But what really has me furious this week is that term Catholic Hospital East. It's no more Catholic than the Communist Party. The head of Catholic Hospital East made $6 million last year.
Wow.
Does that sound like a charity to you?
No, it's a misfortune that happens with some charities, isn't it?
Oh.
That they get to misuse that.
And then,
very shocking.
they sent one of their minions in here who really wrecked the hospital to the point where they had to close it down, or at least they think they do. She was making $500,000 a year with a $200,000 a year bonus at Christmas. Yeah. Does that sound Catholic or Methodist or Lutheran or Baptist to you? It's no more Christian. It should be called Capitalist Hospital East. And I'm telling you, I'm really ticked about that.
Yeah, it's very frustrating when people use these non-profits for personal gain.
$6 million a year.
Not, but some are.
Yeah. Well, at least if they came out and said, "Look, we've switched from being a charitable religious organization to a high profit area," well, you'd say, "Okay, at least they're being honest." They're not being honest. Yeah. And I'm going to say this again. It doesn't affect you, Chris, but it's a big issue in Hornell. I wish that someone would look into suing Capitalist Hospital East for having wrecked our hospital, because that's what they did. They did it, by the way, as far as many of us are concerned, and I'm talking about people with real knowledge. They did it intentionally. Okay, let's go back to names in the news. Eric Holder.
Yeah, well, Mr. Holder is a real disappointment. Again, he has now announced his resignation, and he's using the intervening period to do as much damage as he can. And this is a rather shocking. I mean, he has been consistent, it must be said, in his sort of pushing his agenda and using his power, and both to protect his friends and to hurt his enemies. But he's really gotten himself in a situation now, since he's stepping down, that he no longer feels in any way responsible, being the Attorney General of the people of the United States. He's the Attorney General of his section of the political spectrum. Mm-hmm. And it's been very terrible for the rule of law in this country, because it's slowly sinking in that, people that are here legally don't have to obey the law, wealthy people on Wall Street don't have to obey the law, and when the middle class figures this out, it's going to be devastating for this country when people no longer feel they need to obey the law because other people don't. And Mr. Holder will have a very strong share of responsibility if that takes place.
All right, one more name for you, Al Sharpton.
Yes, well, Mr. Sharpton has now become the leader of the African-American community in the United States. And this is something that Mr. Obama and Mr. Holder have played a role in, and Mr. de Blasio, too, who've had him around all the time. And I think this is, again, a very short-sighted thing to do and a bad example, because there are plenty of articulate and thoughtful black leaders in this country.
I interview them all the time.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. You make a big effort to make sure that you review them, you talk to them, and instead, the leaders of the mayor of New York, the president of the United States, turns to Mr. Sharpton, who, A, has been, involved in very disgraceful misstatements involving the police now for a generation, and two, of course, is the most egregious scofflaw in the case of the income tax that we have. The guy owes millions of dollars. The remark is, doesn't Mr. Sharpton understand that if all the policies he puts into, that he favors were put into effect, his taxes would go up? Oh, yeah, that's right. He doesn't pay his taxes. He doesn't have to worry about taxes going up. He
has been a little outside the law from the very beginning.
Yep. He loves to dance around. He dances on both sides there. And when you take the picture, his foot is on the correct side. But you can see him dancing on both sides of the law consistently. And his statements, again, are very carefully set up to be provocative without getting him driven out. And I think it's been a very bad decision by Mrs. Obama, Holder, and
all right. Now, next question. Then we got to wrap it up.
Sure.
Is Obama doing this intentionally? Is he intentionally stirring up race relations?
Well, as you know, we have the famous question. Suppose, for the sake of argument, arguendo, for the sake of argument, we suppose that he is doing this on purpose. what would he do differently than what he's doing?
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, he's followed a consistent pattern here for years.
Chris, our time is gone. Merry Christmas to you and your bride and your children. We hope to talk to you, before the end of the year, huh?
I hope so. Merry Christmas to upstate New York.
All right, partner.
Bye-bye.
God bless. Bye-bye.
God bless you.